The year is 1470. High in the mountains of Thessaly, where cold wind moves through pine forests and stone valleys, hold every echo like a secret, a bell rings for the final time. Its sound travels across the cliffs, over olive groves, through villages already emptied by fear, and into a valley that will never hear it again. Inside the convent of St. Catherine, 23 women kneel on the chapel floor. Their voices move together in prayer, soft and steady, just as they have every morning for years. But this morning, the familiar words feel different. They do not taste like devotion, they taste like smoke, like ash, like goodbye. Beyond the convent walls, the horizon glows red, not with sunrise, with banners. The Ottoman army has arrived. It does not simply march. It advances like a dark river of steel, banners, dust, and fire, flowing through the mountain roads, with the patience of something that knows it cannot be stopped. Kingdoms have already fallen before it. Cities have already bent. Churches have already gone silent. And now that river has reached St. Catherine. At the front of the chapel stands Sister Eleni, the abbess. Her fingers close around a silver crucifix, passed down through 3 generations of women who believed faith could outlive fear. Her hands tremble, but not because she is afraid. She knows what is coming. They all do. What they do not know, what none of them could possibly imagine, is that death would have been the easier fate. Because what happened next was not written in the history books you were handed in school. It was buried, erased, folded beneath centuries of silence. And only much later, through fragments of missionary letters, Ottoman ledgers, Venetian testimony, and markings carved into stone, would the outline of this forgotten tragedy begin to return. What the Ottomans did to these women was not simple conquest. It was colder than that, more deliberate, more terrifying. It was the calculated destruction of memory. And the question is not whether you can handle the truth. The question is whether you are willing to remember it. If you have ever wondered why some stories survive while others vanish, why certain names are repeated for centuries while others are swallowed by silence, then stay with this story. Because here, in the ruins of St. Catherine, history does not shout. It whispers. And those whispers are about to become impossible to ignore. To understand what happened to these nuns, we must go back 17 years earlier. In 1453, Constantinople fell. The city that had stood for more than 1,000 years, the jewel of the Christian East, the last great stronghold of Byzantium, was broken in 53 days of cannon fire, siege towers, hunger and blood. When the walls finally gave way, the world changed. The Hagia Sophia, once the greatest cathedral on earth, was stripped of its crosses. Its bells were silenced. Its mosaics were covered. Its sacred space was transformed almost overnight. Sultan Mehmed II did not do this simply because he needed another place of worship. He understood something many conquerors never fully grasp. You do not truly defeat a people by killing them. You defeat them by making them forget who they were. The Ottomans did not only conquer territory, they conquered symbols, they conquered memory, they conquered identity. Every church bell that still rang in the conquered lands was more than metal. It was resistance. Every monastery that remained standing was more than stone. It was defiance. Every cross casting a shadow on Ottoman soil was a reminder that the old world had not yet died. And every nun still praying in Latin was living proof that armies could occupy land, but not always the soul. So the empire made a decision. If they would not convert, they would be erased. Not always through slaughter. Slaughter creates martyrs. Martyrs create songs. Songs become stories. Stories become weapons. The dead, if remembered properly, can become more dangerous than the living. The Ottomans understood this, so they refined something quieter. Something that left fewer graves, fewer legends, fewer names, erasure. By 1470, this method had already spread across conquered regions. Greek monasteries in the mountains, Serbian convents in the Balkans, Armenian churches in Anatolia. Some were converted, some abandoned, some absorbed into the machinery of the empire. But the pattern repeated again and again. First came the offer, then came the pressure, then came the silence. The convent of St. Catherine stood far from any army that might protect it, far from any city that might negotiate for it, far from any ally that might even know it was in danger. It sat alone on a hillside, surrounded by cypress trees, cold stone and prayer, and now it had become another test case. Another small entry in the empire's expansion. Another place meant to disappear. But the women inside did not know they were about to become footnotes. They were not soldiers. They had no walls thick enough to resist cannon fire. They had no weapons beyond rosaries, no armor beyond faith. Most had never seen battle. Some had never seen a soldier up close. Many had entered the convent as girls and had lived behind those walls for decades. Sister Eleni had served as abbess for 12 years. Before that, she attended the sick in a village that no longer existed, wiped away by plague in 1448. She had not entered the convent to escape the world. She had entered because the world had broken so much that prayer seemed like the only way to understand it. Sister Magdalena was 19. She had taken her vows only 2 years before. Her hands still carried the rough memory of her father's farm. The old calluses of fieldwork, harvest and hunger she had come to saint. Catherine after her family was killed during a raid. The convent was the first place since childhood where she had felt safe. Sister Theodora was 70. She had outlived 2 abbesses, 1 emperor, and more wars than she could count. Death no longer frightened her. She had been expecting it for half her life. But none of them had ever faced anything like this. And if this moment in history does not move you, perhaps the lesson has already been lost. Because the most dangerous thing a person can do in the face of power is refuse to forget who they are. Now let us return to the convent. The bell has stopped ringing, and the doors are about to break. The first cannonball strikes shortly after dawn. It does not hit the chapel, it hits the bell tower. The explosion shakes the entire convent. Stone bursts into the air, iron screams. Dust rolls through the courtyard like a grey storm. The bell that had called the sisters to prayer every morning for 140 years shatters in mid-swing. Its broken pieces fall into the herb garden below, where the sisters once grew lavender, mint, rosemary, and healing roots for the sick. The same hands that had tended those plants now cover trembling ears. Some of the younger sisters cry out, but Sister Eleni does not scream. She rises slowly, the crucifix lifted in her hand, and then she begins to sing, Creason, Lord, have mercy. At first, her voice stands alone against the thunder outside. Then one sister joins, then another. 23 voices rise inside the chapel, thin but unbroken, meeting the roar of the empire with a hymn. But empires do not listen to songs. By midday, the gates are breached. Ottoman soldiers pour into the courtyard, yet they do not enter like wild men with swords raised. They come with ledgers, with ink pots, with quills, with lists. They move through the convent like clerks of a machine, counting stores, recording names, cataloguing rooms, inspecting walls, grain, candles, icons, books, fabrics, tools. To the empire, these women are not people. They are assets. A translator steps forward. He is Greek. Once he lived in these hills. Now he stands between the soldiers and the sisters, holding a scroll with hands that visibly shake. His voice carries shame beneath every word. By order of Sultan Mehmed II, all subjects of conquered territories must submit to the authority of the Sublime Porte. Those who accept protection under the Sultan will be granted mercy. Those who refuse will be treated as rebels. The chapel falls silent. Sister Eleni steps forward. Her face is calm, almost peaceful. She does not speak to the soldiers. She speaks to the translator, in Greek so clear that every woman in the chapel understands. Tell your Sultan, she says, that we have already given our lives to a king. We have nothing left to surrender. The translator lowers his eyes. The officer in charge, Hassan Pasha, watches her closely. His name appears in scattered references connected to military operations of the period. Whether history remembers him clearly or not, the women of St. Catherine would never forget his face. He does not respond with anger, he smiles. And that smile chills the room more deeply than rage ever could. Because Hassan Pasha understands something the nuns do not yet know. The empire has learned how to break people without killing them. That night, the women are locked inside their own chapel. No food, no water, no candles, only darkness. Outside, the soldiers laugh, eat, drink, sharpen tools, and speak in low voices around fires. Inside, the sisters wait. 2 young women from Corinth begin to weep in the corner. Their sobs echo against the stone. Sister Magdalena, barely 20, crawls toward them in the dark. Her voice is shaking, but the words come anyway. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Another sister joins. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, then another. I will fear no evil. Slowly the weeping fades. The chapel becomes a chamber of whispers. And this is the first mistake the Ottomans make. They believe they are introducing these women to suffering, but these women have spent their lives preparing for it. Fasting, cold vigils, long silence, sleepless prayers. obedience to something greater than comfort. What the soldiers see as punishment, the nuns recognize as discipline. But Hassan Pasha is patient. He has seen resistance before, in monasteries, in villages, in captured towns where people believed faith would hold longer than fear. He knows that a flame often burns brightest before it goes out, and he intends to test how long this flame can last. On the second day, the chapel doors open. A servant enters carrying bread and water. Fresh bread, clean water. He places them on the floor and leaves without speaking. The sisters stare. Their throats are dry. Their stomachs hollow. Their lips cracked from prayer. The younger women look to Eleni. Sister Theodora, the eldest, speaks first. They want us to taste mercy, she says, so that gratitude may become surrender. Eleni nods. Then we fast. No one touches the food. By the third day, their hands shake. Their mouths bleed. Several can barely stand. Still, they do not break. From the courtyard, Hassan Pasha watches. He is impressed, frustrated, and perhaps, for a single moment, almost respectful. But respect does not change policy. On the third day, the doors open again. This time, Hassan enters himself. The translator follows like a shadow. You are not criminals, Hassan says. You are not enemies. You are simply mistaken. The Sultan is merciful. He offers protection, new names, new lives. You only have to speak the words. Silence. Then he continues, or you may come with us to Constantinople. There, perhaps the Sultan himself will hear your case. Perhaps he will be moved by your devotion. He pauses, but the road is long, and the weak rarely survive it. It is not a threat, it is a promise. Sister Eleni looks at her sisters. Some are kneeling with eyes closed. Some are swaying where they sit. Some are so weak, their prayers have become only breath. Then she turns back to Hassan. We will walk. His smile returns. Good, he says. We leave at dawn. That night, the nuns hold one another in the dark. No one has enough strength for speeches, but Sister Magdalena begins to hum a hymn they once sang at Vespers. One by one, the others join. Outside, soldiers hear the sound through the cracked chapel walls. Some pause, some look away. One young soldier, years later, will tell his grandson about the women who sang while waiting to die. That story too will nearly vanish, but for now, the hymn rises into the cold mountain night. Not loud, not victorious, but alive, a prayer, a plea, a declaration we are still here. They leave at dawn on the fourth day, 23 women, hands bound with rope, walking south toward the coast. No carts, no horses, no mercy from the sun. The soldiers do not rush them, they do not need to. The road itself is the punishment. By the second day, Sister Irene collapses. She is 62. Her knees have been failing for years. She tries to stand, but her legs will not obey. The soldiers keep moving. So Sister Magdalena and Sister Anna lift her between them. For 3 miles they carry her. When the column stops that night, Irene is unconscious. By morning, she is gone. The sisters bury her by the roadside with their bare hands. No tools, no bell, no ceremony, only dirt beneath their fingernails and whispered prayers over a shallow grave. Hassan Pasha watches without emotion. Then he writes in his ledger, 22 remaining. On the fourth day, Sister Callista stops walking. She has not spoken since the siege. She simply sits down in the road, closes her eyes, and refuses to rise. The soldiers leave her there. No one knows where she was buried. By the time they reach the port of Volos 7 days later, only 18 remain. But something has changed on that road. At first the nuns had wept, then they had prayed, then they had walked in silence. But the silence they carry now is not defeat. It is decision. The silence of women who have already surrendered everything, except the one thing the Empire cannot take by force, their souls. Sister Eleni walks at the front, even with her hands bound. But on the morning of the 7th day, Hassan Pasha orders her brought to his tent, alone. What happens inside that tent is not recorded in Ottoman records, but a Venetian merchant later described the aftermath in a letter discovered centuries later. He wrote that he saw them bring the abbess back at dawn. She could not walk without help. Her eyes were open, but something inside them had retreated beyond reach. They had dressed her in silk. They paraded her through the camp as though she had converted. But when the merchant passed close enough, he saw her lips moving. She was still praying, silently. In Latin, she had not broken. They had only wounded the part of her the world could see. This was the Empire's most chilling strategy. They did not always want martyrs. Martyrs create memory. They wanted ghosts. People who could breathe, walk, serve, obey, and yet never again be whole. Living warnings. living proof that resistance was useless. At least, that was the plan. Sister Eleni walked with them the rest of the way to the coast, but she never spoke again. The younger sisters wept when they saw her. The older ones prayed harder. At Volos, they were loaded onto a galley. Not a passenger ship, a vessel of control. Rows of benches, chains bolted into wood. Iron rings for wrists. A ship built for prisoners, slaves, and cargo. The surviving nuns were chained to the benches. A later manifest listed them not by name, but by category: female religious captives. 18, destination, imperial household. Purpose, domestic service and conversion. The word service hides more than it reveals. The voyage lasts 12 days. The sea shows no mercy. Storms lash the deck. Salt spray burns their cracked mouths. The ship rises and falls until the women, many of whom have never seen the ocean, are too weak even to be sick. At night, Sister Magdalena whispers psalms beneath her breath. Her voice is almost nothing against the waves, but the other prisoners hear her. Greeks, Serbs, Italians, men and women chained in darkness. Heads turn toward her voice. For a few moments each night, the ship seems less like a prison and more like a floating chapel. Then at dawn on the 12th day, Constantinople appears. Domes, minarets, walls, water flashing in the early light. The city rises from the Bosphorus like a blade. For centuries, it had been called the city of the world's desire. Now for these women, it is a cage. From the docks, they are marched through narrow streets, crowded with merchants, soldiers, servants, slaves, and children who stop to stare. Christian nuns among the captives are rare enough to draw whispers. They are led past walls older than empires, through imperial districts, beside gardens where fountains sing and peacocks scream. Then they reach the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the great church that is no longer theirs. The sisters are forced to stop, forced to kneel. The call to prayer rises from the minarets above them. One of the sisters whispers, so quietly only Magdalena hears, "We are home, but it is no longer ours." Then they are taken to the palace, not to the bright halls where ambassadors bow, not to courtyards where viziers, scheme and servants move like shadows. They are taken below, down stone steps that spiral into darkness, through corridors smelling of damp earth, old smoke and locked rooms, to a place that official maps do not name. A place meant not to exist, and if you are still listening, it is because some part of you understands that this story was never only about the past. It is about every voice power tried to bury, every name removed from a record, every prayer whispered where no one was supposed to hear it. So follow them now, beneath the palace, into the dark. Below Topkapi Palace, there are tunnels that tourists never see. Storage chambers, servant passages, forgotten rooms cut into stone. Corridors that twist through the bedrock like veins beneath the body of the empire. And in one sealed corner, hidden behind a false wall for centuries, there was a room with no official purpose. During restoration work in 2011, workers broke through that wall. What they found was not treasure, not weapons, not royal secrets. They found scratches, dozens of small crosses carved into stone, crude, uneven, some made with broken pottery, some so shallow they looked like they had been made with fingernails. And beneath them in Latin 4 words, Lux in tenebri luce, the light shines in the darkness. This was their chapel. Not a chapel with stained glass and bells, not a chapel with an altar, priest, incense, or icons. A room beneath a palace, a hidden wound in the stone. For months, perhaps years, the surviving women of Saint Catherine lived beneath the machinery of empire. By day, they worked as silent servants. They scrubbed floors, washed linens, carried water, tended fires for rooms they would never enter, moved quietly through a palace that treated them as shadows. But at night, when the palace slept, they gathered in that forgotten chamber. They had no Bible, so they used memory. They had no priest, so they used courage. They had no altar, so they placed a scrap of linen over stone. They had no chalice, so they used a stolen cup. They had no candles from home, so they made small lights from wax, herbs and whatever they could hide, and they prayed. Not loudly, not safely, but faithfully. They recited psalms half remembered from childhood. They whispered hymns so faintly the stone barely caught them. They shared communion with bread taken from kitchens and water drawn from palace wells. And they carved crosses into the wall, one scratch at a time, a record no empire had authorized, a history no sultan had approved. Sister Magdalena was among them, the girl who had whispered psalms on the ship, the girl who had carried Sister Irene along the road, the girl who had watched Sister Eleni return in silk, and understood that the body can be controlled while the soul still resists. In the darkness beneath the palace, Magdalena became their voice. Archaeologists later found a small bird scratched into the corner of the wall. Beside it were 23 lines, one for each sister from St. Catherine. Only 11 lines were complete. The others trailed into nothing. Each night, the women gathered in the hidden chapel. No sermons, no choirs, no bells, only whispers. One sister would kneel and share a memory. The smell of bread before dawn, her mother's hands. A church bell in a village now gone. The colour of mountain light on the convent wall. The sound of rain on roof tiles. The warmth of a sister's hand during winter prayer. These memories became their new psalms. Small offerings to a God they believed still listened, even in the dark. A Venetian prisoner held in the palace for ransom in 1478 later wrote of strange voices beneath the women's quarters. Women singing in Latin, praying to a God not of the empire. For centuries, historians dismissed the account as rumour, superstition, a prisoner's fantasy. Then the chapel was found, and the walls began to testify. But here is where the story becomes unbearable. The crosses stop. Halfway along the wall, the marks change. The lines become deeper, more desperate, less orderly, as if whoever carved them was running out of time. Then nothing. Ottoman records from 1482 mention a cleansing of palace staff under a new sultan. Anyone considered resistant, unproductive, or politically inconvenient was removed. No names, no burial places, no details, only one word in a ledger. Disposed. The nuns of St. Catherine vanished. 18 women who survived the siege, who walked 7 days through dust and grief, who crossed the sea in chains, who carved prayers beneath an empire. Gone, but not completely, because the chapel remained. A French diplomat in 1712 wrote about a rumour among older palace servants. They said that on certain nights, in the lower halls, the air would grow cold, and if a person listened closely, they could hear women singing in Latin. He dismissed it as servant superstition, but the walls do not care what diplomats believe. In 2011, when the hidden chamber was examined, traces of wax were found, not ordinary palace wax. Older mixtures, wax blended with herbs like the candles made in convents, which means the vigil lasted longer than anyone expected. Months, perhaps years. Night after night, the women returned to that room, even as their number grew smaller, even as names disappeared, even as hope should have become impossible. They kept carving. Magdalena's bird was the final mark. Beside it, scratched so faintly that it nearly vanished into the stone, were 2 Greek words, "We endure." But the truth is greater than that. They did more than endure. They left proof. Proof that empire could command bodies, but not memory. Proof that walls could become witnesses. Proof that even silence can speak, if it is carved deeply enough. The Ottoman Empire lasted until 1922, 6 centuries of conquest, law, architecture, administration, war, diplomacy, and power. Its sultans ruled across continents. Its armies redrew maps. Its decrees shaped languages, cities, cultures, and borders. But what survived in that hidden room was not a decree, not a victory inscription, not Hassan Pasha's ledger, not the silk they placed on Sister Eleni. What survived were scratches, crosses, a bird, 23 lines, and 4 Latin words carved by women the world was meant to forget. Lux in tenebri luce, the light shines in the darkness. So why does this story matter? Because it is not only about religion, and it is not only about the Ottomans. It is about what power does when it wants people erased, and what people do when they refuse to disappear. An empire had armies, cannons, ships, palaces, prisons, records, officials, translators, and centuries of authority. The women had fingernails, broken pottery, memory, faith, and yet 500 years later, we are speaking of them. That is not the kind of victory empires understand. They did not reclaim their convent. They did not walk free. They did not live to hear their names restored. But they left a mark, and sometimes in history, a mark is enough, because history may be written by victors, but memory is kept alive by survivors. And sometimes survival looks like a cross carved into a wall where no one was ever supposed to look. A prayer whispered in a forbidden language. A bird scratched into darkness to remember sisters who fell along the road. A phrase left behind for strangers centuries later. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. The nuns of St. Catherine lived forward into darkness. They walked knowing the road might kill them. They crossed the sea knowing captivity waited. They descended beneath a palace, knowing they might never again see the sun. Still they carved, still they prayed, still they remembered. And centuries later, someone looked backward and found them. Now you have found them too. When archaeologists stood in that hidden chapel in 2011, staring at the crosses carved into stone, one of them reportedly asked a question that has never stopped echoing. How long did they keep the vigil? The wax suggests years. The depth of the carvings suggests repeated effort. The uneven lines suggest exhaustion, urgency, perhaps grief. Which means these women returned night after night to that chamber, even after sisters disappeared, even when the marks became fewer, even when the darkness should have swallowed everything. They kept going. That is not passive suffering. That is defiance. Quiet, disciplined, unarmed defiance. The kind empires fear most because it does not depend on armies. It depends on memory. The Ottoman Empire is gone now. Its sultans are dust. Its armies are history. Its palaces are museums. Tourists walk through bright halls, take photographs, admire tiles, fountains, courtyards, and domes, often unaware of what may have once existed beneath their feet. But the crosses remain, and that Latin phrase, barely visible after 5 centuries, still speaks. Lux in tenebri luce, the light shines in the darkness. It comes from the Gospel of John, a verse about a light that cannot be extinguished, about truth that survives even when power believes it has buried everything. Sister Magdalena carved those words, knowing she might never leave that palace, knowing her name might be erased, knowing the world might go on without remembering her, but she carved them anyway, because she understood something empires almost never do. You can conquer land, you can rename cities, you can turn churches into monuments of victory, you can erase names from ledgers, you can bury bodies without markers, but you cannot destroy what people carry inside them, and you cannot silence what they leave behind in stone. The nuns of St. Catherine were supposed to vanish. That was the design. Break them, rename them, scatter them, turn them into servants, converts, ghosts, or numbers in a palace record. Make sure no songs were written. Make sure no graves became shrines. Make sure no stories survived. But the plan failed, because they are still here, in the crosses, in the hidden chapel, in the bird carved by Magdalena, in the 23 lines, in the words, "The light shines in the darkness." And now they are here with you, because you listened, because you remembered, because for a few minutes you refused to let silence have the final word. Lux in tenebri luce, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.